The engine of the McLaren 720S screamed down Park Avenue, echoing between the cold glass buildings of Manhattan. Daniel Rowe gripped the leather steering wheel tightly, eyes on the rain-slicked road ahead. But his mind was somewhere else, somewhere without boardrooms, without applause, and without anyone waiting for him at home. A stain of black coffee still marked his white designer shirt, the bitter scent soaked into the car's climate control, blending with the rich oak wood of his cologne. Luxuries he once thought would make life feel worth it. His Rolex read 6:47 p.m. He had just missed yet another global board meeting, the third this month. But truthfully, he no longer cared. The company ran, hundreds worked under the Rotec banner, but Daniel himself was no longer living in his own life. The traffic light ahead turned green. Daniel didn't move. It wasn't until an impatient horn blared behind him that he pressed the accelerator, not out of urgency, but like a man fleeing from his own existence. In the rearview mirror, he caught a glimpse of himself. Tired brown eyes, a furrowed brow carved deep by exhaustion, salt and pepper hair combed neatly but unable to hide the weight of time. 48. Net worth, $1.2 billion. 3 companies, 2 penthouses, 1 yacht, and not a single soul to call family. His phone buzzed. A call from his assistant, maybe a dinner reminder, or a concern carefully disguised in a professional tone. Daniel stared at the glowing screen, then coldly pressed decline. The phone dropped onto the passenger seat, flipping open like a gasping breath. "Damn it," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. The sound of his own voice echoed inside the luxury car, a chamber so silent that every word rang like a solitary bell. And then, he saw it. A delivery truck barreling through a red light at an insane speed, coming from the cross street on the right. In that half-second of clarity, Daniel could do nothing, just feel the cold metallic taste of fear in his mouth. This was the end. The crash was thunderous. Metal twisted into metal. Glass exploded. The McLaren spun 3 times before slamming into a lamppost, crumpling like paper in a storm. Daniel's body shattered with each slow-motion second. A searing pain tore through his chest, ribs splintering into lung. Blood filled his mouth, thick and iron-tasting. He tried to scream, but only a raspy moan escaped. Flashing lights, ambulance, street lamps, the horrified faces of strangers. Everything blurred, like a film played in slow motion. Daniel Rowe, the man who once seemed invincible, was no longer a CEO, no longer a billionaire, just a broken body, alone in a tangle of steel and carbon fiber, under the steady New York rain. And that was when everything began to change, just not in the way anyone expected. The scream of the ambulance tore through the gray New York rain, slicing through the indifference of the city like a blade. The back doors flung open, and medics rushed toward the crumpled shell of what once was a McLaren. Inside, Daniel Rowe lay motionless, half of his body pinned beneath the twisted steering column. Male, mid-40s to 50, multiple traumas, possible brain injury, and pneumothorax. Weak pulse. Alert Mount Sinai, ICU. The paramedics moved with speed and precision. Daniel was lifted onto the stretcher, neck stabilized, oxygen mask secured, fluids administered. One arm hung limp over the edge, blood dripping steadily from his forehead into the rain, like life itself was draining out of him. On the way to the hospital, Daniel drifted in and out of awareness. At times, he heard sirens, urgent voices. At others, there was only thick, impenetrable darkness. Every heartbeat, every shallow breath was a battle against the inevitable. Inside the ER, Dr. Aidan Brooks, chief neurologist, studied the CT scans with a heavy gaze. Cerebral hematoma, broken ribs puncturing the right lung, severe brain trauma, surgery now or he won't make it. The operation lasted nearly 6 hours. Monitors blinked erratically. Alarms screamed. Daniel lay there, stripped of titles and suits, stripped of the empire he had built. Just a body, fighting for breath. When the surgery was over, they moved him to ICU room 204. Wires, tubes, and beeping machines surrounded his bed. The lights glowed a tired amber. No visitors, no flowers, no cards, only silence. Not much time, Dr. Brooks told the night nurse. The swelling's pressing against the brainstem. He might not wake up. 24 hours, tops. Daniel Rowe, the man who once moved global markets with a tap on his keyboard, now floated silently in the space between life and death. And no one knew that just hours later, a woman no one noticed would step through the door of room 204 and change everything. 5 a.m. The alarm shrieked through the dim basement apartment in Queens. Emily Carter reached over to silence it, blinking into the familiar darkness. The damp ceiling, the slow drip of old pipes, the silence that had long since stopped feeling lonely. She rolled out of her narrow metal frame bed, her bare feet touching the cold cement floor. In the faint light, her navy blue uniform hung neatly on the wall hook beside her worn-out sneakers. Emily sighed and pulled her dark brown hair into a tight bun, just like every other morning. No mirror, no makeup. Just another day beginning at Mount Sinai Hospital. She had worked the night shift for 3 years now, cleaning, emptying bins, disinfecting patient rooms. No one knew her name. No one remembered her face. But she remembered every hallway, every numbered door, especially the ICU, where the air was always thick with that unspoken tension between life and death. Emily once had dreams, college, interior design. But when her father, David Carter, was diagnosed with end-stage heart failure, those dreams faded like dust on an unopened book. She dropped out, took every job she could, paid for every pill, every scan, every meal. And this hospital, Mount Sinai, had once stolen all her hope, then quietly returned it. 3 years ago, she had stood in the ICU hallway, tears streaming down her cheeks as she held the final overdue medical bill. The doctors said her father needed to stay, but they couldn't afford one more night. She begged banks, called friends who no longer returned her calls. Then, a white envelope arrived. No name. Inside, a check for $15,000, along with a single line. No need to pay it back. Just keep loving. She never found out who sent it. Only a nurse's vague whisper. Some quiet man, well-dressed, asked about a crying girl in the ICU. She kept that envelope in her drawer for 3 years. And today, as if fate had circled back, she returned to the ICU, pushing her cleaning cart like every other day. Room 204's door was slightly open. She peeked in, and her heart stopped. A man lay motionless among wires and tubes, his face pale, battered, but unmistakably familiar. Her eyes froze on him, then widened in shock. She took half a step back. It was him. She didn't know his name, but she knew that face. The quiet stranger who once saw her. The man who had given her father a second chance. The one who vanished without asking for anything. And now, he was here, alone, balanced on the edge of life and death. Emily stood frozen in the doorway, her hands trembling. She knew the rules. No staff were allowed to linger in patient rooms without reason. But some debts, she thought, aren't paid with money. Emily stood frozen at the doorway of room 204. Her hand still gripped a cleaning cloth, but her heart was no longer there. It had drifted 3 years back, to this same hallway, with the same beeping machines, the same antiseptic air, and the same tired yellow light on the tile floor. That day, her father lay inside the ICU, hooked to machines, his body frail like a flame about to flicker out. Emily had stood outside, clutching a final bill in her hand, eyes raw from crying. She was preparing to lose the only family she had left. She remembered the moment a man in a suit approached her, calm, measured. "Miss Carter," he said, "an acquaintance of mine heard about your situation and wishes to help. He prefers to remain anonymous. No thanks necessary." He handed her a sealed envelope. Inside, a check for $15,000, enough to cover hospital fees, medications, and a few months of breathing room. Emily had cried harder than she ever had, not for the money, but because, for the first time in months, she didn't feel alone. And now the man who had saved her father lay here, alone, surrounded by wires and whirring monitors, and that steady mechanical breath of a machine doing what his body could no longer do. Emily looked up and down the hallway. It was empty, no nurses nearby. She took a deep breath, slid her cleaning cart aside, stepped into the room, and quietly closed the door behind her. The heart monitor beeped rhythmically, a slow, sad melody on loop. She approached the hospital bed, never taking her eyes off that battered face, swollen, pale, but unmistakable. Still him, the man who had once changed her life with silent kindness. "Hi," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know if you can hear me, but I'm Emily. Emily Carter." She reached for his hand. It was cold and still, but she held it anyway. "My father, he's alive because of you. You never knew that, did you? But I knew. I've been trying to find a way to thank you for 3 years. I never knew how, but now I do." She paused, breath catching in her throat. "Now I'm here for you, not because of rules, not because it's my job, but because I owe you a life, and because no one should have to leave this world alone." Emily sat in the chair beside his bed, just like so many families had done before her. But this wasn't just a patient. This was the man who had seen her once, through a crowd, without needing a name or reason. She reached into her pocket and pulled out an old photo. She and her father, smiling on the porch the day he came home from the hospital. Healthier than he'd looked in years. She gently placed the photo into Daniel's hand. "If you wake up," she whispered, "I'll tell you everything. About him, about me, about the little miracle you created without even knowing." Then she sat silently, still holding his hand, eyes closed. Outside, the hospital world continued as usual. But inside room 204, the world had paused. Night fell heavy over the city, pulling a curtain of silence across the streets. Inside ICU room 204, Emily Carter sat still, her hand wrapped gently around Daniel Rose. The ventilator hummed softly. The heart monitor beeped in its cold, repetitive rhythm. A few nurses passed through the hallway beyond, but none entered. No one knew she was here. And if they did, they wouldn't understand why a janitor sat here, like a grieving daughter. But Emily knew. She stayed not out of obligation, but because something inside her whispered, he shouldn't be alone tonight. From her pocket, she pulled a small, worn notebook. Flipping through its pages, she read aloud fragments of journal entries. Words she had written during stolen minutes of rest. About her father, about her helplessness, about a stranger's gift she never got to repay. "I remember that night, when the hospital said we couldn't stay another day. I thought everything was over. Then the envelope arrived. I never knew who sent it, but I always believed it came from someone with kind eyes, someone who didn't want to be thanked." The cold air from the ceiling vents brushed her neck, but she didn't shiver. Her eyes remained locked on Daniel's bruised and swollen face, once so strong, so commanding, now still, caught between two worlds. She began to sing, a lullaby, just a few lines. Something her father used to hum when she was sick. It was a soft, fragile sound. But in this room, it was the most human thing of all. "You're not alone," she whispered. "I'm here." Then, something miraculous happened. At first, she thought her eyes deceived her. But no, a single tear rolled from the corner of Daniel's eye, slowly, clearly, down his bruised cheek, onto the pillow. Emily froze. "Daniel?" No answer, but the monitor began to shift. Heart rate rising slightly, oxygen saturation improving, blood pressure stabilizing. Every number on the screen was changing. She began to cry, this time not from fear, but from awe. You can't fake a tear in a coma. You can't fake life returning. A footstep echoed in the hall. The door opened, spilling light into the room. The night doctor entered, confused at first, then stunned. "What are you doing in here?" he began, then looked at the monitor. His eyes widened. "Oh my God," he breathed. "The vitals. They're changing. He's responding. How?" Emily took a small step back, but didn't let go of Daniel's hand. "I don't know what happened," she said, her voice cracked with emotion. "I just know. He wasn't supposed to be alone." In silence, the doctor nodded. Emily sat again, her hand still resting in Daniel's. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt grateful. Grateful that she had been here when it mattered. She leaned in and whispered, not to him, not to God, maybe just to herself. If a tear can change everything, then maybe presence is a kind of miracle too. The early morning light crept through the ICU window, casting pale rays into a room still holding the chill of the long night. Machines beeped steadily, faithfully, but something had changed. Emily was still there, her head resting gently on the edge of the bed. Her hand never let go of Daniel's. It was warmer now than it had been hours ago. She didn't know when she drifted off. Eyes closed, breathing soft, at peace after a night of vigil and tears. And then, a movement, so slight, a twitch of a finger. Then again, Emily jolted awake, startled, until she realized what was happening. Daniel was moving. She leaned closer, cautious, afraid it was just an involuntary reflex. But no. The hand she held began to squeeze, lightly, tentatively, as if searching its way out of a dream. "Daniel," she whispered, trying to steady her voice. "Can you hear me?" No answer right away, but his face shifted, a twitch in his brow, a motion at his lips. Then from cracked, dry lips came a sound, barely more than breath. "Who?" Emily broke into tears. She squeezed his hand tighter, nodding over and over, her tears landing softly where their hands met. "It's me. Emily," she said shakily. "You're awake. You're safe. It's going to be okay." Daniel struggled to open his eyes. His eyelids felt like lead, dragged down by weeks of sleep. But finally, slowly, they lifted, red, blurred, but alive. His first sight was the hospital ceiling, then IV lines, the ventilator, blinking monitors, and finally in the face of the woman beside him, her eyes dark with worry, but glowing with warmth. "Who are you?" he whispered. Emily smiled through her tears, nodding gently. "We'll talk later. But for now, just know this. You're not alone anymore." The call for a nurse echoed down the hall. Dr. Brooks arrived minutes later, his face frozen in disbelief before rushing to Daniel's side, checking vitals, monitoring reflexes. "He's really awake," the doctor murmured, half in awe. Daniel scanned the room, still disoriented, his body aching, senses blurred. But one thing was clear: someone had stayed. He looked at Emily again, this time longer, not because he remembered, but because he felt it. That strange but soothing sense that someone had held him here. And he whispered, barely a sentence, barely sound. "You stayed?" Emily only nodded. She didn't need to say more. The question was enough. And in that moment, something new had begun. 2 days after waking up, Daniel was finally strong enough to breathe on his own. He was still weak, his voice rough, his memory scattered, but his eyes were brighter. And every time he woke, his first question was, "Where is she?" Emily. She came every day, quietly sitting beside him, changing his cold compress, reading aloud, sharing stories about hospital chaos or street traffic, like they were old friends reconnecting after years apart. Daniel didn't know why she brought him peace, but deep inside he felt she had been there, long before he ever realized. One quiet afternoon, as sunlight angled through the hospital window, Emily brought something she had kept for 3 years, a white envelope. She placed it gently in his hand. "You probably don't remember," she said, eyes lowered, "but 3 years ago, a man saved my father's life. He gave this, anonymously. This is what he left behind." Daniel didn't just regain his breath that day, he regained purpose. And with each passing hour, that purpose took shape. Daniel opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a photocopy of a $15,000 check and a note in faded handwriting. "No need to pay it back. Just keep loving." He stared at the paper for a long moment. A crease formed between his brows. And then, like a wisp of smoke, memory returned. He saw himself standing in the hospital hallway 3 years ago, a young girl crying, clutching a medical bill. Something unexplainable stirred in him that day, enough to make him act. He never thought he'd see her again. His voice trembled. "It was you." Emily nodded. "And now, you're the one who needs someone to stay." Daniel didn't speak. Instead, he reached out and held her hand. In that white room, two strangers who had once passed each other like shadows were now bound by a memory, a silent debt, and something deeper than gratitude, a connection between two souls that had quietly saved each other when no one else could. That afternoon, sunlight streamed through the hospital corridors. Daniel was finally strong enough to walk on his own, with a wooden cane gifted by his doctor, a quiet symbol of how far he'd come. He asked to take a slow walk to the hospital garden, where Emily often sat during her breaks. She was there, in a simple blouse, hair tied back neatly, eyes calm, but no longer weighed down by sorrow. When she saw him approach, she didn't gasp or rush to help. She simply smiled, as if she'd been quietly waiting all along. Daniel sat beside her on the bench, taking in a deep breath. The breeze was cool, the trees swayed gently, and sunlight painted everything gold. "Can I ask you something?" he said, his eyes fixed far ahead. "Why did you do it? Stay with me that night. You didn't owe me anything." Emily turned toward him. Her eyes were soft, but her voice steady, almost like a whisper carried by wind. "Because no one should have to die alone." Daniel didn't reply at first. He simply looked down, letting those words sink in. Then he nodded, not as an answer, but as a quiet surrender. No one had ever said that to him before. "And if I hadn't woken up?" he asked. "Then I still would have stayed," she said without hesitation. "Because once you stayed for me, without knowing my name, without asking anything in return." For the first time, Daniel turned to look directly into her eyes, and in that gaze there were no roles left, no patient, no hospital staff, no old debts, just two people who had once stood at the edge of loss and somehow held each other back from falling. He slowly reached out his hand. Emily glanced down, then placed hers into his, just like that night. Only now, it was a beginning. 1 month after leaving the ICU, Daniel Rowe had made a full recovery. His body hadn't regained all its strength yet, but his mind was clearer than ever. Each morning he walked the hospital garden. No cane, no assistance. His face no longer wore the cold mask of a financial titan. Instead, it held depth, softness, and gratitude. He didn't return to the boardroom. He didn't reclaim his title or office. Not because he couldn't, but because he knew he no longer belonged there. Instead, Daniel returned to Mount Sinai, not as a patient, but as a man given a second chance at life. 3 months after his discharge, he officially launched the Second Light Foundation, a charity dedicated to supporting low-income hospital staff, patients in financial crisis, and emergency medical cases needing immediate aid. The launch was simple, meaningful. No press, no flashy announcements, just doctors, nurses, janitors, the people behind the scenes of healthcare. Daniel stood on stage, microphone in hand, his eyes fixed on Emily sitting in the front row. "There was someone who stayed with me between life and death," he said. "She taught me that no one should be alone, no one should be invisible, whether they're a patient or someone cleaning the hallway." The room was silent. Then he continued, without warning. "And because of that, I would like to invite Emily Carter to be the first executive director of this foundation." Emily froze. From a forgotten hospital worker to being called by name in a room full of professionals, she could only stare at Daniel, her eyes full of surprise and fear. After a long pause, she rose. No tears, no drama, just a deep, quiet nod, as if her entire life had just turned a page. "I don't know if I'm ready," she said softly, firmly. "But if second chances exist, then I'll live this one with everything I have." Emily Carter never imagined herself sitting in a glass-walled office overlooking Central Park, signing off on the first official grant of the Second Light Foundation. Just a year ago, she was a janitor waking up at 5 a.m., living in a basement apartment in Queens, and now she was the executive director of a growing nonprofit. Not because of luck, but because she chose to stay when no one else did. But she didn't stop there. Emily enrolled in night classes on nonprofit management and leadership skills. At first, she doubted herself, worried she wouldn't keep up. But each lecture, each chapter read, reminded her she belonged here. Daniel was the first to show up for her certification ceremony. He sat quietly in the back row, saying nothing, but his eyes sparkled with pride, something she'd never seen in anyone before. They didn't talk much about feelings, but their connection grew deeper, unspoken, steady. They worked side by side every day, reviewing cases, visiting hospitals, debating strategies. Daniel, who once led billion-dollar companies, listened to Emily as if her voice carried something more powerful than data, perspective. And Emily? She became the heart of the foundation. Staff admired her humility, her strength, the way she remembered every name, every story. She never forgot where she came from, and that's what made her exceptional. One late evening, after finishing a meeting at an outer borough hospital, Daniel drove her home. The city shimmered in the night, headlights flickering past. "You once said you didn't want to live another day," Emily said softly, eyes on the road ahead. "What about now?" Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then he turned toward her, voice gentle. "Now, I want to live, day by day, but not alone." Emily looked at him surprised, not at the words, but because for the first time, she saw no loneliness in his eyes. Only the presence of someone who had chosen to stay. That night, under the quiet hum of city lights, neither of them spoke again. Because sometimes rebuilding a life starts with one person who simply refuses to walk away. In the months that followed, the relationship between Daniel and Emily didn't shift suddenly. It grew like a quiet tree, reaching slowly toward the light. They were still co-directors of the foundation. They still met each morning in the office, shared lunches on the 10th floor balcony overlooking the city, worked late over thick grant applications. But something had changed, not in their routines, but in the way they looked at each other. Daniel began to notice small things. The peppermint tea Emily always made, the chair she favored when reviewing reports, the way she tied up her hair when focused, and Emily found herself smiling whenever she heard his footsteps in the hallway, or missing something when he wasn't around. Some evenings after meetings ended, they stayed back, just to talk. About Daniel's childhood on the coast of Maine, about Emily's first winter alone in New York. These conversations weren't long, but they lingered, like a quiet melody that played softly, long after the music stopped. No one mentioned feelings, no one rushed, but in the spaces between schedules and silences, something deeper was taking root, without needing a name. One evening, rain poured down, trapping them in the office. They sat by the window, watching the city blur in sheets of gray. Daniel turned to Emily and said, almost in a whisper, "Thank you for not leaving." Emily didn't answer. She simply nodded, but in her eyes everything was clear. That was the moment they both knew. They were no longer just partners in work. They were quietly stepping into each other's lives, with grace, with care, and without fear. The small garden behind Mount Sinai Hospital was adorned with soft golden string lights, draped gently over tree branches, creating a warm, quiet space that felt like a fall painting. Emily stepped into the garden, surprised. She thought she was attending a simple gathering for the foundation, but the neatly arranged chairs, candlelit tables, and twinkling lights told her otherwise. Daniel stood at the center wearing a modest gray suit, but his face glowed brighter than all the lights around him. Their eyes met, and for a moment, everything else faded. Emily walked slowly toward him, unsure. "What's going on?" she asked, half smiling, half nervous. Daniel smiled back. "Just something small," he replied, then gestured toward the stone bench at the edge of the garden, the same one where she had once sat beside him through the night. "I remember that night," Daniel said quietly, "when I didn't know who I was, if I'd ever wake up. You were there, you never left." Emily said nothing, but her eyes shimmered. "And I thought," he continued, "if I've been given back my life, then I want to give it back to someone who taught me how to live." He knelt down. No fanfare, no big gesture. Just a quiet, sincere moment between two people who had already lost everything and found something greater. From his pocket, he pulled a small velvet box. Inside was a simple silver ring. No diamonds, no flash. But engraved inside were the words, "You stayed." Emily covered her mouth, tears spilling, but her smile beamed. "Emily Carter," he said, "will you walk with me into whatever's next, not just as the woman who saved me, but as the one I want to wake up beside every morning. Under the flickering lights and glowing candles, Emily nodded. Yes, she whispered. And this time, I won't just stay, I'll walk beside you. Applause erupted gently from behind the trees. Foundation staff, doctors, nurses, they'd all quietly gathered to witness the moment. No loud cheers, no shouting, just warm, grateful eyes in the wind. That night, the garden, once the edge between life and death, became the beginning of something new. A life built on love, gratitude, and choosing to stay. The garden at Mount Sinai Hospital, once the edge between life and death, where Daniel first opened his eyes again and later knelt to propose, now became their wedding aisle. No extravagant decorations, no celebrity guests, just rows of wooden chairs lining a path strewn with white petals. Soft, golden string lights twinkled in the branches above, catching the gentle glow of late afternoon. Everything simple, everything just right, like their love. Emily wore a plain white dress, her hair falling loosely over her shoulders. But the most touching moment came when an elderly man stepped from the front row and offered her his arm. Not in reality, but in her heart, it was her father. Before the wedding, she told Daniel, I always dreamed he'd walk me down the aisle. Today I'll bring him with me, in memory and in love. As she stepped into the center of the garden, everyone stood. And at the end of the petal path stood Daniel, not the man from Forbes covers, but one whose heart had learned to live and love. The officiant was none other than Dr. Aiden Brooks, once Daniel's doctor in crisis, now the witness to this moment of healing and new beginnings. When I first met Daniel, he began, he was unconscious. Today I see a man fully alive. Because of her, the vows were not long, just, I choose to stay every day. I choose to walk beside you every day. Applause rose around them, and in that small garden, among those who had walked with them through the darkest hours, a perfect circle closed, only to begin again in love. That morning the sky was soft blue, golden light spilling gently across the trees in Mount Sinai's garden. Daniel and Emily walked side by side, slowly along the stone path. The very path where everything once teetered between life and loss, hope and surrender. They didn't speak, just walked together, hand in hand, carrying a quiet peace they'd once believed they might never find again. A man who once gave up, a woman who once lived unseen, now walking forward, fully, clearly, together. A breeze caught Emily's scarf. Daniel turned just to see her, to feel the presence he never wanted to lose. She met his eyes with a soft squeeze of his hand. Nothing more needed to be said. Then a voice spoke, low, steady, like the last breeze closing the chapter. Miracles aren't always loud. They're not blinding lights or standing ovations. Sometimes a miracle is simply a hand held at the right moment, a decision to stay, a whisper that says, I'm not going anywhere. And that is enough to begin a whole new life. The camera pulls back slowly, leaving behind the image of two souls walking together beneath the trees in the very place where everything began. Some stories don't end. They echo, like a whispered promise in the dark. I stayed, and I always will.